May 11, 1945. Off the coast of Okinawa, a lone American destroyer waited on the edge of the ocean, guarding the fleet, yet marked for death. Hundreds of Japanese kamikazes were coming straight for her. Below deck, a quiet mechanic checked a set of pipes and valves the Navy had once rejected. A strange idea no one believed would work. When the first planes dived and the sky turned into fire, that idea became the crew's only chance to survive. It wasn't a weapon or armor. It was one man's stubborn invention that saved an entire ship and changed the US Navy forever. So stay with us till the end to discover how one mechanic's rejected idea saved America's fleet from kamikaze attacks. If you love true World War II stories of courage and ingenuity, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and help us bring more forgotten history to life.
The Pacific was grey that morning, a colour that seemed to swallow everything it touched. The USS Hugh W. Hadley floated at Radar Picket Station 15, 50 miles north of Okinawa, where destroyers were sent to die so that the fleet behind them might live. It was May 11, 1945. Dawn came with the hum of generators, the metallic clink of shell casings being stacked, and the smell, that strange mix of salt, oil, and fear that men would later say you could taste on your tongue before a kamikaze attack ever began. On deck, Seaman First Class Walter Clark tightened the bolts of a makeshift water hose line, one that had been rerouted by the ship's mechanic against official specifications. "The brass says it's overkill," Clark muttered, "but out here, there's no such thing." His voice was drowned out by the steady whir of radar antennae sweeping the empty sky. To the men, that rhythmic pulse was both heartbeat and death knell, a sound that could, at any moment, mark the beginning of another hellish hour. By mid-morning, the sky was deceptively calm. From the island's direction came a faint droning, distant, insect-like. The radar operator called out, "Bogies, bearing 080, Angels 8 closing fast." The ship's alarm blared 3 times. Men sprinted to battle stations. Every muscle remembered the drill. Every hand moved automatically. But everyone knew drills were lies compared to what came next. The first kamikaze appeared as a silver flash against the clouds. Then another. Then 12. The Hadley's guns opened up. 40mm Bofors, 20mm Oerlikons, 5-inch mounts, belching fire and thunder into the air. Spent shells rolled like coins underfoot. The ship trembled with each blast, the deck plates hot beneath their boots. The paradox was cruel. The most vulnerable ships were also the most vital. Destroyers like Hadley were thin-skinned,
barely armoured, yet they bore the responsibility of absorbing the first shock of Japan's final weapon. The Navy had calculated acceptable losses, 1 ship out of every 3 at picket duty, and the math was as cold as the sea around them. By 9:20 a.m., over 150 aircraft had appeared on radar screens across the picket line. Many would turn toward the Hadley. Lieutenant Robert Rogers, the gunnery officer, would later recall, "It wasn't a battle. It was a demolition. The sky fell in pieces. The first Zero came low, streaming smoke, and struck the port side near Mount 2. The explosion tore open compartments and sent oily smoke rolling across the deck. Water mains burst. Fire mains hissed steam. Then something remarkable happened. The mechanic's unauthorized modifications, the extra hoses, the portable pump rerouted through secondary lines, held. Fire teams flooded the burning deck within seconds, choking the blaze before it could reach the ammunition magazine. In Navy procedure, it was a violation. In practice, it was salvation. The crew fought off wave after wave, 12 confirmed kills, then 16, then 23. Every gun overheated. The Hadley's ammunition handlers broke open locker doors with hammers when the power failed. Out of 370 men aboard, 28 were killed and 68 wounded. But the ship stayed afloat. When rescue tugs finally arrived, sailors wept openly, not because they had won, but because they were still alive. Hours later, as the smoke cleared and the ocean shimmered with wreckage and oil slicks, a strange silence settled. The Pacific was calm again, too calm. "We were a floating cemetery," one sailor wrote in his diary that night, but somehow the dead shared the deck with the living, and both owed their lives to one man's disobedience. The Hadley would go down in history as the most heavily attacked ship to survive a single engagement. Her survival was not due to official doctrine or engineering perfection. It was due to something far less glamorous, a mechanic's stubborn belief that bureaucracy had missed the point. But before that act of quiet rebellion could be understood, the world would need to understand the weapon it was built to defy, the kamikaze. October 25, 1944. The sky above Leyte Gulf was a blaze of sunlight and oil smoke. Below, the sea churned with wreckage, the graveyard of Japan's Imperial Navy taking shape in real time. In the command tent at Mabalakat Airfield, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi spoke quietly to a group of young pilots. "If we are to save Japan," he told them, "there is no other way but to crash our planes into enemy ships. The life of one pilot for one vessel, that is our strategy now." It was not a decision born from fanaticism alone. It was arithmetic. Japan had fewer than 3,000 operational aircraft left in the Philippines, while the Americans could field 10 times that number. Their shipyards launched a new destroyer every 4 days, a new escort carrier every week. Industrially, the war was already lost. The only remaining currency was blood, and Onishi meant to spend it. The first kamikaze, literally, divine wind, attacks struck the escort carriers St. Lo, Kalinin Bay, and Kitkun Bay. When a single Zero packed with a 500-pound bomb slammed into the St. Lo, the explosion set off her bomb magazine, turning the carrier into a fireball that rose 1,000 feet into the sky. Out of 889 aboard, 114 died. But to the Japanese press, it was heralded as a miracle of honor. To the Americans, it was a new horror they could barely comprehend. Captain Walter Stafford of the Kitkun Bay later wrote, "It wasn't the accuracy that shocked us. It was the intent. You can prepare for a torpedo, you can dodge a bomb, but how do you stop a man who doesn't intend to come back?" By early 1945, Japan had organized formal Tokatai units, special attack corps. Over 3,800 pilots would die in suicide strikes before the war's end. Their weaponry ranged from Ute-dated fighters to specialized craft like the Oka rocket plane, essentially a human-guided missile carrying 2,600 pounds of explosives. One Oka hit could split a destroyer clean in half. The paradox was immediate and devastating. Japan's most desperate tactic was also its most efficient. For every 10 planes launched, at least 1 or 2 found their mark, a hit rate nearly 50 times greater than conventional bombing. Against radar picket destroyers, those odds were catastrophic. A fleet that once feared submarines now feared the sky. To counter this new terror, the US Navy threw everything it had into the Pacific Shield. Radar operators were trained to spot low-flying aircraft within a 2-minute window. Gunners were ordered to maintain 24-hour readiness. Ships were positioned in a deadly perimeter. Small vessels at the edge to take the first strike, the carriers protected in the center. The men aboard those picket destroyers began calling their stations sitting duck duty. Fire control drills grew relentless. Onboard damage control teams practiced sealing flooded compartments, rerouting pipes, patching hulls with mattresses and steel plates. Yet by early 1945, the statistics were brutal. Over 400 Allied ships damaged or sunk by kamikazes, 4,900 sailors killed, and nearly 4,800 wounded. The destroyer Bush vanished in a single hit. The Morrison broke apart and sank in minutes. And still, the attacks came. The Japanese had turned death into an industrial process, one that could not be intercepted, only endured. American sailors developed an eerie instinct. They could smell an approaching wave before they saw it. The scent of aviation fuel and salt mixed with something else, something unspoken. "You could feel it in your bones," a Laffey crew member said. The ocean would go still, even the wind held its breath. The Navy's official manuals were rewritten almost weekly, each time trying to catch up with the chaos. But doctrine lagged behind reality. When a kamikaze struck, it didn't just explode. It sprayed burning fuel into corridors, severed fire mains, and ignited the very systems meant to save the ship. The rules of engineering had failed against the physics of desperation. Out of that failure came the first whispers of innovation, unapproved, unsanctioned, often unwelcome. In the shipyards of Ulithi and the forward bases of Okinawa, Men who were supposed to follow blueprints began to bend them. Mechanics, welders, and engineers, men with grease-stained hands and tired eyes, saw that the Navy's textbooks were killing them faster than the enemy. One of them, an unassuming petty officer from Wisconsin, scribbled a note in the margin of his maintenance log. Problem: fuel fires spread faster than hoses can reach. Solution: portable pump, independent line, immediate foam. It was a simple idea, but it violated nearly every line of the manual. Command rejected it. He built it anyway. That mechanic's defiance would ripple through the fleet, quietly saving hundreds of lives long before the Navy even noticed. But before his idea could take root, doctrine itself had to fail, publicly, painfully, and beyond denial. In theory, every American destroyer was a masterpiece of order. Every valve labeled, every hose mapped, every compartment numbered. In practice, order was exactly what doomed them. By 1945, U.S. naval doctrine was a cathedral built on predictability, and the kamikazes tore through it like a hurricane through stained glass. The system was supposed to work like this: a hit, a report, a coordinated response through the damage control central. Teams would follow the charts, open designated valves, start pumps, and smother the flames with seawater or CO2. But in Okinawa's spring heat, the theory melted under fire. Planes came in too fast, too low, and too many at once. 1-0 could sever the fire main that supplied every hose on the ship. Another could ignite aviation gas across the deck before a single valve was turned. The Bureau of Ships had designed destroyers for torpedoes and shell fire, precise, localized impacts. Kamikazes were chaos incarnate: fire, debris, and burning fuel cascading through open hatches. One hit might cripple communication, short-circuit electrical lines, and blow out the firefighting system in a single breath. Doctrine demanded calm, calculation, and chain of command. Survival demanded improvisation. On April 6, 1945, the destroyer Bush was struck 3 times within 30 minutes. The third plane exploded near her aft engine room, rupturing her boilers. Without pressure in the fire mains, water couldn't reach the flames. Within minutes, the heat detonated her depth charges. She split in half and sank, taking 87 men with her. The post-action report ended with 4 words: total loss, no remedy. The tragedy multiplied. Between March and June 1945, nearly 1,900 kamikaze sorties were launched. 34 ships were sunk, 368 damaged, and nearly 5,000 sailors killed. The mathematics of sacrifice that Onishi had proposed were paying grim divide. Ends. For every American carrier saved, 2 destroyers were crippled. Aboard the Stanley, Lieutenant Edward Weiser wrote in his log, "The rules don't work. The book tells us what to do when the sea comes in. It doesn't tell us what to do when the sky does." His words echoed across a fleet, learning that bureaucracy could burn just as easily as fuel. The Navy's engineers back in Pearl Harbor and San Francisco studied the wreckage like pathologists at an autopsy table. They found patterns, not in the attacks, but in the failures. Most ships that sank after a kamikaze hit weren't destroyed by the initial explosion. They were lost to fire. The fires spread faster than systems could respond. Pipes failed, pumps jammed, and the centralized layout, once hailed as efficient, turned out to be the Achilles heel of the entire fleet. The paradox deepened. America's engineering genius, the very thing that had built the world's mightiest navy, had created ships too perfect to survive imperfection. "We built them to be machines," one shipyard engineer admitted, "but men needed them to be animals, to fight back when wounded." To their credit, many officers tried to adapt. The destroyer Laffey, under Commander Frederick Beckton, rewrote its own damage control protocols after the Bush disaster. Beckton ordered extra hoses welded into place, foam lines rerouted through independent valves, and portable pumps stored in ammo lockers. The Bureau of Ships reprimanded him for unauthorized modification. He ignored them. Then came April 16, 1945, the day Laffey would be tested in the most ferocious assault any ship had yet endured. At dawn, radar lit up with 22 contacts. By 8:30 a.m., Laffey was under attack from 50 kamikazes. For nearly 90 minutes, she fought alone. 6 planes struck her directly. 4 bombs exploded on deck. The fires reached temperatures hot enough to melt paint off bulkheads, yet the ship did not sink. The post-battle analysis credited her superior firefighting coordination. But the crew knew better. It wasn't coordination. It was disobedience. The rerouted lines and redundant pumps, the very things Washington had forbidden, had kept seawater flowing to every corner of the ship. The foam flooded burning compartments before they could detonate. A machinist's mate named Harold Fanning summed it up later in his journal. They said, "Follow procedure. We followed instinct instead. Turns out instinct floats better." For the Navy's bureaucracy, this was an uncomfortable revelation. Every success at the front was a quiet rebuke to the manuals written in rear area offices. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Survival rates among modified destroyers were rising. Fires were being contained faster. Ships that should have been lost weren't. Still, change came slowly. The Navy's wartime bureaucracy moved at the speed of paperwork, not panic. It would take more blood, more wrecks, and one stubborn mechanic to force the system to listen. As the Laffey limped back to port, her hull scarred and her decks blackened, one question lingered in the reports. What if these ideas had been adopted sooner? The answer, and the man behind it, waited in the humid air of Ulithi Atoll, torch in hand, blueprint rolled under his arm, ready to rebuild what doctrine had destroyed. Ulithi Atoll, April 1945. The air was heavy with salt and diesel, the lagoon crowded with ships that looked more like survivors than weapons. Bent radar masts, scorched hulls, decks streaked with soot. The scars of Okinawa floated here, waiting for repair. Among the swarm of welders, electricians and pipe fitters moving through the wreckage, one man worked quietly at the base of a battered destroyer. His name was Chief Petty Officer Harold W. Adams, a machinist from Kenosha, Wisconsin, whose idea had already been stamped rejected 3 times by Navy Command. Adams wasn't an officer or an engineer. He'd started as a car mechanic before the war, fixing tractors and assembly line presses. His hands were thick, scarred, and permanently blackened at the fingertips from grease. He had no college degree, but he had a kind of instinct that machines seemed to understand. He knew when metal was about to fail just by the way it vibrated under a wrench. The Navy, however, was built on hierarchy. Designs came from Washington, not the docks. Every bolt, every valve, every line had to match a manual written by men who had never heard the whistle of a diving Zero. When Adams submitted his modification proposal, portable pump unit with independent intake, capable of feeding any deck hose in case of mainline rupture, the response was curt. Unnecessary redundancy, not to be implemented. But Ulithi was far from Washington, and Adams knew that out here, regulations didn't put out fires. He began testing his unnecessary redundancy anyway. He scavenged a spare gasoline pump from a landing craft, a few yards of high-pressure hose, and a barrel of AFF, aqueous film-forming foam, a compound then considered too new and too unstable for widespread use. By night, while the officers slept, he ran trial setups behind the forward bulkheads. The device was crude, but effective, In 30 seconds, he could have foam shooting into a burning compartment, even if every primary system had been destroyed. His crew called it Harold's Spitfire. Command called it a hazard. He didn't care. The way I see it, Adams told a shipmate, the ocean don't read blueprints. If she wants to kill you, she'll find the shortest pipe. News of his rig spread quietly among mechanics and damage control officers cycling through the Ulithi yards. Some copied it outright. Others adapted the idea. Portable foam units, makeshift bypasses, external couplings that allowed one ship to pump water into another's hull. These were solutions born not of permission, but of desperation. It wasn't heroism. It was practicality. When the destroyer Newcomb limped in after a kamikaze hit, her entire midsection was blackened and gutted. Adams's improvised pump helped douse a smouldering ammunition magazine that threatened to detonate the next morning. The officer of the deck made a single note in the logbook. Unorthodox system employed. Successful. It was the closest thing to recognition Adams would ever get. The paradox ran deep. The Navy, an organization built on discipline and hierarchy, was now being saved by disobedience. Commanders who once punished unauthorized modification began quietly asking for copies of the same. The Bureau of Ships had no record of this device, no schematics, no manual. Yet across the Pacific, Adams's idea spread like a rumor of hope. In May 1945, the Laffey's after-action report mentioned a similar system in passing. Portable pump lines rerouted through secondary foam intakes greatly aided in extinguishing fires forward. No name was attached, no credit given, but the fingerprints were Adams's all over. He was eventually called to a makeshift briefing aboard the repair ship Vestal. An engineer from the Bureau of Ships questioned him for nearly an hour. "You realize," the officer said, "you've violated 4 separate sections of the manual." Adams simply nodded. "Yes, sir. But we've also got 4 ships that didn't sink." The officer didn't reply. But a week later, an internal memo circulated to all forward area maintenance units. It read, in clipped bureaucratic phrasing, "Temporary auxiliary pump assemblies authorized for emergency field use pending further evaluation." No one mentioned Adams's name, but he didn't need them to. The real proof would come on the open sea, on a destroyer where his rejected design would meet its ultimate test. The USS Hugh W. Hadley had just arrived from Okinawa, her decks repaired, her crew refitted, her hull patched with plates that still smelled of burned paint. Adams had worked on her personally, tightening every hose coupling himself. When she steamed out again toward Radar Picket Station 15, he stood on the dock and watched until the grey silhouette merged with the horizon. He didn't know it yet, but in less than 2 weeks, his unauthorized pump would face the kind of fire no manual had ever prepared for, and it would save the ship that carried his fingerprints. Okinawa, April 16, 1945. The sea was slick with smoke and shrapnel when dawn broke over Radar Picket Station 1. On board the USS Laffey, DD 724, the men stood at their stations, already sweating in the humid morning air. Commander Frederick Julian Beckton, a soft-spoken Mississippian with steel-grey eyes, paced the bridge. He'd been awake since before sunrise, reviewing damage control drills he had personally rewritten against official protocol. He believed in practice, relentless, exhausting, endless practice. "We'll fight like we train," he told his crew, "and we'll train like we're already burning." It was an eerie prophecy. By mid-morning, radar lit up with what the operator first mistook for birds. Then came the call. 20 bogies inbound, bearing 240. The alarms wailed, gunners swung into position. Below deck, the smell of hot metal and paint mingled with the ozone crackle of the communication circuits. Above, the sky shimmered with movement, the first wave of kamikazes. The attack came like a storm with no sound at first. Then, all at once, a roar that shook the sea itself. Zeros dove at impossible angles, so low their wingtips sliced ocean spray. The Laffey's guns opened up, the air filled with tracer fire, glowing orange ribbons that stitched the sky. Within minutes, the destroyer was engulfed. A Val dive bomber hit the aft 20mm gun mount, detonating its bomb on impact. The blast ripped open the deck and threw gunners across the steel. Fire burst through the passageways. Then came the second, a Zero clipping the mast, shearing cables, and crashing into the deckhouse. The ship's engineering log recorded the moment with chilling precision. 0855. Fire mains forward destroyed. 0902. Secondary lines activated. 0905. Foam pressure sustained via auxiliary system. That auxiliary system was one of Beckton's unauthorized installations. AISAI. Modification inspired by the whispers of Adams's portable pump design. The Laffey's machinists had copied it during a repair stop weeks earlier. When the main line ruptured, those backup hoses kept the foam flowing. The crew fought fire with water and willpower. As flames rolled down the port side, Beckton's voice came through the loudspeakers. "We're staying up. We're fighting back. Nobody abandons ship unless she goes under us." It wasn't bravado. It was defiance of inevitability. The ship endured wave after wave, 22 kamikazes in 80 minutes. 7 struck directly. 4 bombs exploded on board. The ship took more than 400 hits from machine guns and shrapnel. One plane tore through the aft deck and spun into the sea, missing the ammunition magazine by a miracle. When the smoke cleared, Laffey was barely recognizable. Her decks were pitted, her guns melted into black silhouettes. Out of 336 men aboard, 32 were killed and 71 wounded, but the ship remained afloat, refusing to die. In the aftermath, an officer aboard the nearby LCS-51 radioed, "You're still there? God almighty, how?" Beckton's reply became legend. "We're staying afloat. We're not going down for anybody." The paradox of the Laffey's survival baffled engineers back at Pearl Harbor. Damage assessments predicted total loss, yet she made it back to port under her own power. The answer lay in the ship's improvisation, and the men who'd refused to follow procedure. Machinist's mate Harold Fanning later told a reporter, "When the power went out, we had to guess which valves were open. The diagrams were useless. Half the ship was gone. We just followed the sound of pressure and hoped the next pipe didn't explode in our faces." That instinct, that human defiance of engineered order, became the dividing line between those who survived and those who didn't. The Navy had discovered a truth that no doctrine CETO would deny: flexibility, not rigidity, saved ships. The Bureau of Ships convened an emergency review 2 weeks later. For the first time, reports began referencing field improvisations as contributing to survival. But even then, official endorsement was slow, buried in footnotes and technical jargon. Commanders in the field couldn't wait. Word of the Laffey spread across the Pacific like a sermon. In the mess halls and bunk rooms of the destroyer fleet, her name became shorthand for resilience. Crews began copying her layout, building makeshift pumps and foam lines out of spare equipment. One machinist joked, "We're all building our own Laffey now." Yet not every ship had the time to adapt. The kamikaze threat was still intensifying. The picket line off Okinawa remained the deadliest duty in the US Navy. Ships continued to burn, and innovation continued to come from desperation, not doctrine. Among those who took Laffey's lessons to heart were the men aboard the Hugh W. Hadley. Their chief mechanic, the same Adams who had been told no too many times, had outfitted her with everything he'd learned from Ulithi and the field. When the Hadley steamed toward her next picket post, she carried more than ammunition and men. She carried an unspoken experiment in survival. And soon, that experiment would be tested under the most ferocious kamikaze attack of the entire war. May 11, 1945. The sky over Okinawa was clear and deceptively calm when the Hugh W. Hadley, DD 774, and Evans, DD 552, took their posts at Radar Picket Station 15, a lonely grid on the map, 50 miles northwest of Okinawa, where destroyers were sent to act as the island's early warning line. It was called the Graveyard Station. The sailors knew why. Lieutenant Commander William M. Bill Went stood on the bridge of the Hadley, scanning the horizon through salt-fogged binoculars. The radio hummed with reports from other stations, warnings of bogies inbound echoing from every direction. Went knew they were surrounded before a single plane appeared. Below decks, Chief Machinist Adams tightened the valve on his custom-built foam system, the same one his superiors had dismissed as non-standard. It had saved lives before. Now it would decide whether his ship lived or died. At 7:45 a.m., radar picked up the first wave. More than 150 enemy aircraft forming up in the east. They were a mix of Zeros, Vals, and twin-engine Betty bombers. By 8:25 they were closing fast. The destroyers opened fire, joined by a ring of smaller support craft, LCS L-82, LCS L-83, and LCS L-84. The sea erupted in orange tracers. The first kamikaze came in from high altitude, diving at 400 miles an hour. The Hadley's 5-inch guns barked, the shells bursting mid-air, black puffs against the morning blue. The plane disintegrated before it reached the ship, its burning engines skipping across the waves. The crew cheered. Too soon. Because the next wave didn't come one by one. They came all at once. Zeros from the north, Vals from the south, and Bettys from directly ahead. More than 50 aircraft converging in coordinated suicide runs. The air became a thunderous blur of engines and explosions. One Val clipped the mast and tore through the forward gun mount. Another slammed into the aft deckhouse, detonating its bomb. The ship shuddered. Flames rolled through the starboard side. The foam lines hissed to life. Adams's system. It sprayed across the deck, choking the fires before they reached the magazine. The men fought the blaze with bare hands and scorched shovels, dragging hose lines through smoke so thick it turned daylight into dusk. But the assault didn't stop. At 9:20 a.m., a twin-engine Betty hit the Hadley broadside, its bomb tearing through the hull and exploding below the waterline. The blast threw sailors into the air. The ship listed hard to port, 10 degrees, then 15. Water poured through ruptured seams. Power flickered, died, came back. The auxiliary pumps, again Adams's work, kept the pressure steady. For nearly 2 hours, the Hadley was hit by 4 direct kamikazes and 3 bombs, taking on water faster than damage control could measure. Yet somehow she remained afloat. Every compartment was a battle of its own. Men knee-deep in water, choking on smoke, pulling fuses from scorched panels and hot-wiring circuits with knife blades. In the forward engine room, a sailor named Harold Red Jensen wrapped his burned hands in rags and cranked open a valve that no longer had a handle. He shouted, "This is what you call fighting for your paycheck." The men laughed through the chaos, short, hoarse bursts that sounded more like survival than humor. By 10:30, the sky was littered with wreckage, smoking pieces of aircraft falling like rain. Over 150 Japanese planes had attacked the 2 destroyers. The Evans was crippled, her bridge destroyed, decks on fire. The Hadley was barely alive, her guns silenced, her radar mast gone, her hull groaning like a wounded animal. Then, silence. The air raid ended as abruptly as it had begun. The sea was eerily calm again, save for the crackle of burning metal and the low whine of emergency pumps. When the rescue ships arrived hours later, they found Hadley still afloat. Her engines were dead, but her pumps, jury-rigged, scorched, half-melted, were still pushing water overboard. Out of 363 men aboard, 28 were killed, 67 wounded, and every survivor bore burns, bruises, or blood. The medical officer later wrote in his log, "Every man became a fireman today. Every man saved this ship." When Admiral Spruance received the report, he simply said, "The Hadley should not be alive." The Hadley's survival wasn't luck. It was innovation, disobedience, and the stubborn ingenuity of men like Adams. When Navy engineers later examined the wreck, they found that his foam and pump systems had contained 4 separate fires that would have otherwise detonated the ship's magazines. The report was classified for years, filed under field modifications, damage control, unauthorized. Yet word spread anyway. Crews began building their own versions on ships across the Pacific. What had begun as a machinist's rejected idea had now rewritten the Navy's approach to survival. The Hadley's story became a living parable, proof that the difference between disaster and endurance often lay in the hands of those who refused to wait for permission. But the cost was clear. The Pacific was littered with ships that hadn't been as lucky, or as defiant, and as Okinawa turned into a graveyard of steel and fire, the lessons learned in blood began reshaping the very doctrine of the US Navy. The Navy's investigation into the Hugh W. Hadley began even before the smoke cleared from her decks. When she was towed back to Karamaretto, damage control officers, engineers, and Bureau of Ships, BUSHIPS investigators swarmed her hull like surgeons around a patient who had defied death. They counted 67 major penetrations, 4 direct kamikaze strikes, and 3 bomb impacts, any one of which should have sunk her outright. Yet she floated, scarred, silent, but alive. A commander from BUSHIPS, clipboard in hand, muttered, "This ship shouldn't exist." His assistant replied, "Maybe not, but she's telling us how the next ones might." The post-battle analysis revealed something remarkable. Non-standard field modifications had prevented cascading fires and compartment floods that typically doomed other vessels. Foam lockers added outside the blueprints, portable gasoline pumps mounted near the boiler room, extra watertight doors welded in without orders, all of it improvised by enlisted mechanics and petty officers. These weren't textbook solutions. They were born from desperation and experience. And they worked. Word of the Hadley's survival raced through the Pacific Fleet. At Ulithi, at Leyte, at Pearl Harbor repair yards, machinists began comparing notes. Crews on the Laffey, Brain, Douglas H. Fox, and Pickens traded sketches of new hose arrangements and emergency manifolds scrawled on ration boxes. The designs spread faster than official doctrine ever could, passed from ship to ship, mess hall to mess hall. In one letter home, Seaman First Class Tom Reeves wrote, "They say the Navy gives us the best ships money can build. I say the best ships are the ones we build ourselves when the shooting starts." By July 1945, ships formally adopted some of these field innovations as official recommendations. Foam extinguishing systems became standard across destos. Royer classes. Portable fire pumps, previously considered hazards, were reclassified as essential. The Hadley's ad hoc redundancy wiring became the prototype for a new auxiliary circuit standard. The irony was glaring. The same modifications once labelled unauthorized were now etched into the manual. What had been rebellion had become regulation. At the Mare Island Navy Yard, engineers tested a mock-up of Adams's foam delivery system, the same design once rejected for complexity. The tests showed it could cut fire suppression time by 40%. Unorthodox, the chief engineer admitted, but it keeps ships afloat. In Washington, Admiral Nimitz's office received a confidential report summarizing the Kamikaze campaign. 3,800 Japanese aircraft had carried out suicide missions since October 1944 and 68. Allied ships had been hit. 36 sunk outright. Damage control improvements had reduced loss rates by nearly 30% in the last 3 months of the war. Numbers could be cold, but to the men in the Pacific, those numbers meant lives, and proof that ingenuity could win battles where armor and guns could not. On the Hadley herself, engineers preparing her for tow back to the US found notes still taped to bulkheads. Tested, use the bypass first. Run foam lines before you see smoke. Don't wait for permission. These scrawled instructions became informal scripture for damage control training in the months that followed. When Japan surrendered in August, the Hadley was still under repair at Hunter's Point. Her decks bore the scars of that day at Picket Station 15, blackened metal warped by heat, gun barrels twisted like iron vines. Sailors who served aboard visited her in dry dock, running their hands along the steel that had somehow held. "She's ugly," one said, "but she earned it." Ship's engineers photographed every inch of her hull. They traced the lines of melted piping, catalogued the patches, and diagrammed the improvised systems. The report ran 142 pages and ended with a single understated sentence. The Hadley's survival is attributable to field modifications, rapid manual response, and exceptional crew initiative. Within 2 years, those 3 principles would define the Navy's new damage control doctrine. Training films were produced with titles like When Fire Strikes Below Deck and Improvisation Under Pressure. They taught young sailors that when equipment fails, thinking cannot. The mechanic whose idea had once been rejected was never promoted, never decorated. His name appeared only in technical footnotes. But his work, the hoses, valves, and pumps cobbled together in a hot steel belly, outlived him. In the following decades, the Hadley Standard became Navy shorthand for adaptability, the idea that no ship should be entirely dependent on the blueprints written on land. As the war ended, a Navy that had once prized conformity discovered that its survival had depended on defiance. Orders built ships, but initiative saved them. And yet, the paradox deepened. The very war that had demanded obedience had also proven that disobedience, when born of duty, could be the purest form of service. The Pacific Fleet steamed home battered but unbeaten. But for every ship that returned, dozens rested beneath the waves. Silent reminders of lessons learned too late. The Navy was changing, quietly, irreversibly, shaped not by admirals in Washington, but by the hands of grease-stained mechanics who refused to let their ship die. Those lessons would soon move from patchwork decks to polished classrooms, and from wartime improvisation to peacetime doctrine. When peace finally came, it did not arrive with cheers aboard the Hugh W. Hadley. It arrived with the hiss of acetylene torches in a quiet California shipyard as repair crews cut away her twisted plating and exposed the bones of a ship that should have been lost. The war had ended, but its lessons still smouldered in her hull. In Washington, the Navy convened a post-war board to evaluate what it called emergency damage control practices. The report opened with a blunt acknowledgement. The Japanese kamikaze presented the Navy with a new form of warfare for which no manual existed. That sentence, more than any other, summed up the paradox that had haunted the Pacific. The idea that the world's most organized Navy had been saved not by its structure, but by those who dared to go beyond it. The unnamed mechanic, known in records only as Chief Machinist Adams of the Hadley, never sought recognition. When interviewed in 1946, he said simply, "We didn't invent anything new. We just didn't wait to die." His words captured the raw spirit of thousands of sailors who had learned that survival meant adaptation. By 1947, Adams's once unauthorized design had become part of the naval ship's technical manual, Section 5555, Firefighting and Damage Control Systems. Every destroyer built afterward included dual foam systems, portable pump redundancies, and accessible fire mains, all direct descendants of the Hadley's improvised setup. What began as defiance had become doctrine. But the legacy wasn't only in metal and machinery. It lived in a new mindset that transformed naval culture. Training schools in San Diego and Norfolk began teaching initiative under duress as a formal skill. New sailors learned to think like engineers and problem solvers, not just operators. "If you wait for orders in a fire," an instructor barked, "you've already lost the ship." The Hadleys awed. Eel also forced a re-examination of hierarchy. Wartime analysis revealed that ships with flexible leadership, captains who trusted their enlisted men to improvise, had 30% higher survival rates than those that adhered strictly to procedure. The Navy, once rigid to its core, began to reward innovation instead of punishing it. In 1950, when the Korean War reignited the Pacific, the destroyer Lyman K. Swenson survived 2 near-fatal strikes off Incheon, thanks to redundant foam systems directly modelled on the Hadley. An after-action report ended with the quiet line, "The lessons of Okinawa endure." Even decades later, in Vietnam and the Persian Gulf, when modern ships battled fire and missile strikes, engineers still invoked the Hadley standard. Every hose rack, every redundant pump, every emergency manifold traced its lineage to one mechanic's stubborn refusal to accept that good enough was enough. There was, however, a deeper meaning that outlived the steel and statistics. The Hadley story revealed something elemental about war itself, that the greatest strength of a free society lies not in blind obedience, but in the courage to question when lives are at stake. In the ashes of Okinawa, America learned that ingenuity was its truest armor, that even in a machine as vast and bureaucratic as the Navy, the human hand, the grease-stained, calloused, ungloved hand, could still shape history. Years later, at a reunion of Hadley survivors, now grey-haired and slow-moving, one sailor pointed at a rusted section of her hull preserved in a naval museum. "You see that burn mark?" he said. "That's where Adams's pump line held. That's why we're here." No medals, no parades, no textbooks bore his name. Yet every sailor who ever trained in damage control, every crewman who learned to improvise under fire, lived by the ghost of his idea. They had come to war believing survival was written in orders. They left knowing it was written in initiative. This wasn't propaganda, it was reality, and it shattered everything the Navy once believed about discipline, obedience, and the line between chaos and command. In the end, America's greatest weapon was not its battleships, not its bombs, not even its carriers, but its capacity to adapt. The enemy sent men to die for orders. America sent men to think for life. And that difference, that simple, defiant idea, saved a fleet, and perhaps the future